Okay, wow, you sent us a whole stack of material on pantheism. Looks like we're going deep on this all-as-one concept.
It's everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Ancient Egyptian whispers, modern YouTubers finding Christ after exploring pantheistic ideas. It's incredible how this idea keeps popping up. But let's be honest, sometimes these philosophical deep dives can feel like wading through a swamp.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, our mission is to help you navigate the maze of pantheism.
Find the solid ground, or maybe the quicksand.
Right. And to really understand why it matters.
What I find so intriguing is how pantheism, despite its many forms throughout history, keeps bumping up against the same fundamental problems.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like this beautifully complex puzzle where the pieces just don't quite fit, you know?
I see, yeah.
And those gaps, those misfits, they reveal a lot about the nature of reality itself.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is pantheism?
Right, it's not like there's a membership card or a secret handshake or something.
Yeah, no pantheism clubhouse.
Not that I know of, but it's more like a spectrum of beliefs centered around this core idea that God is everything and everything is God.
Okay, I think I get that, but can you give me an analogy, something to help me wrap my head around it?
Sure. Think of the ocean. It's not just the water.
Right.
It's also the waves, the spirits, the creatures, the sunlight interacting with it, all of it together. That is the ocean.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture. But how does that translate to God? Are we saying that God is the trees and the rocks, even us?
Exactly. And there are different flavors of pantheism, different ways of understanding this concept.
Like what?
Well, some forms, called monistic pantheism, believe there's only one substance in the universe. Everything's part of that one substance.
Okay.
A good example is the Hindu concept of Brahman,
Oh, Brahman.
that ultimate reality that everything comes from. Other types, like naturalistic pantheism, they find divinity in the interconnectedness of nature.
I could see why that would be appealing. Everything being connected, part of this grand, unified thing. It feels very hopeful somehow.
It definitely has allure, especially today when so many people are looking for spiritual meaning outside of traditional religions.
Yeah, it's like spirituality without the dogma.
Right, this idea of oneness, of transcendence, of being part of something bigger. It's very seductive. But that's what this deep dive is going to show us. When you really examine those alluring ideas, they start to unravel.
Okay, so you're saying it's not all sunshine and rainbows?
Not quite. This deep dive tackles several errors of pantheism. It starts with its faulty foundations.
Okay, let's unpack that. Faulty foundations. What does that even mean?
Well, imagine you're building a house, right? But the foundation is cracked and uneven. No matter how beautiful a house is, it's eventually going to crumble.
Right.
Pantheism has similar cracks. Those cracks are in its foundation.
Okay, I get the metaphor. But what are these cracks? Give me an example.
One of the biggest ones is this idea of monism. It's this idea that only one substance exists,
Mm-hmm.
and everything is part of it. But if that's true, then why do we need all these practices?
Practices? You mean like meditation?
Exactly. Like meditation, yoga, things to achieve enlightenment. Why bother if we're already divine?
That's a good point. What are we even trying to achieve if we're already part of this one substance? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it calls this the self-refuting nature of pantheism.
Self-refuting, huh?
Yeah. It's claiming one thing, but then the practices contradict that very claim.
Okay, so that's one crack. What else is shaky in this pantheistic foundation?
Another big one is this idea of human divinity. We are all inherently God.
It sounds appealing though, right?
Oh, absolutely. Almost empowering, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it can lead to dangerous thinking. If we're all God, then who are we to judge anyone's actions? What happens to concepts like morality and accountability?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like everyone gets to make up their own rules. That could lead to some pretty chaotic situations. So basically, pantheism struggles with some pretty basic logic problems right from the start.
Right, and the deep dive goes even further, highlighting all these logical fallacies.
Fallacies, those errors in reasoning.
Exactly, and they pop up again and again in pantheistic thinking.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Let's dive into those fallacies. What kind of mental gymnastics are we talking about here?
Well, one of the most common ones is equating interconnectedness with divinity.
Okay,
Just because everything in the universe is connected, like think of an ecosystem,
right.
doesn't automatically mean everything is God.
Oh, I see. So just because things are linked doesn't mean they're all divine.
Exactly. It's a faulty jump in logic. The deep dive points out that this kind of thinking, it often stems from this very human desire to find meaning.
Meaning.
Yeah, and belonging in the universe. We see how everything's interconnected and we want it to mean something bigger,
Right.
something spiritual. So we kind of slap this label of divine on it.
It's like we're trying to force fit reality into our desires rather than really examining what's true.
You got it. Another fallacy is mistaking subjective experience for objective truth. Pantheism, it often relies heavily on personal feelings and intuition.
So just because something feels true doesn't automatically make it true.
Exactly. You can feel confident about something,
Right.
but that doesn't mean you're actually right. Like trusting your gut feeling to tell you if a mushroom is poisonous.
Oh yeah, that's a bad idea.
Exactly. And the deep dive highlights the danger of elevating personal experience over reason and external validation, especially when you're dealing with big, complex spiritual concepts.
So far, it seems like pantheism is having a rough time holding up under scrutiny. Where do we go from here? What else does this deep dive uncover?
Well, once we see these foundation and logical errors, the deep dive takes us even further down the rabbit hole. It exposes the self-defeating nature of some of pantheism's core claims.
Self-defeating. Oh, you've got my attention. Tell me more.
Well, one of the most glaring examples is this tension between non-dualism, that all is one idea, and the need for these practices to achieve enlightenment.
I mean, that seems contradictory, right?
It is. If everything's already unified, divine, what are we even working towards? It's like saying you need to merge with the ocean while you're already swimming in it.
Okay, that's definitely a head-scratcher. It seems like pantheism can't even keep its own story straight.
Right. And the deep dive, it calls this an internal contradiction.
An internal contradiction.
Yeah. The ideas within pantheism clash with each other. Another example is this struggle to reconcile God being both immanent within everything and transcendent beyond everything.
So it's saying God is both part of the universe and separate from it at the same time. How does that work?
It doesn't really. It's like trying to say a drop of water is both completely part of the ocean, right?
Yeah.
And somehow also distinct from it at the same time.
Oh, okay.
Pantheism tries to have it both ways, and it ends up in this logical loop-de-loop that just doesn't make sense.
All right, so we've got cracks in the foundation, logical fallacies, and now these internal contradictions. It's starting to feel like that house we talked about earlier, it's about to collapse.
You got it. And the deep dive doesn't stop there. It goes on to show how pantheism crashes with things outside of itself. And that leads to even more problems.
Okay, I'm ready for the next level of this pantheism takedown. What kind of external conflicts are we talking about?
One of the biggest ones is the conflict with scientific understanding.
Okay.
Now look, science and spirituality, they don't always have to disagree.
Right.
But pantheism often makes these claims about reality that just don't line up with what we know from science.
Give me an example.
Sure, like it might talk about the universe being eternal, right? But the laws of thermodynamics, they suggest that everything eventually runs out of energy. Or it might talk about manipulating this cosmic energy. But there's no scientific evidence to back that up.
So it's like pantheism is trying to fit square pegs into round holes when it comes to science.
Exactly. And this isn't just about nitpicking details. When a belief system contradicts well-established scientific principles, it raises serious questions about its validity.
That makes sense. If your worldview can't account for the observable universe, that's a pretty big red flag. But science isn't the only thing pantheism clashes with, right?
Right. The deep dive also highlights this clash with core Christian doctrines.
Okay.
For example, that idea that God is this impersonal force or inseparable from the universe. Well, that directly contradicts the Christian belief in a personal, transcendent creator.
So it's like two completely different starting points for understanding reality.
Exactly. And those different starting points lead to very different conclusions about everything.
Right.
From the nature of humanity to the meaning of life to how we even deal with suffering and evil.
That's a good segue to our next point. Pantheism also seems to have a hard time dealing with concepts like sin and salvation, right?
Right, exactly. Pantheism, it often views evil as this illusion or as a necessary part of the whole. Christianity sees it differently.
How so?
Well, Christianity sees sin as a very real and devastating consequence of humanity's rebellion against God.
Okay.
And when it comes to the solution, pantheism focuses on self-realization.
Self-realization as the path to liberation.
Yeah, exactly. While Christianity points to God's grace, received through faith in Jesus Christ, as the only true source of salvation.
So it's a fundamental difference in how we understand the problem and the solution.
Exactly. And that difference has huge implications for how we live our lives,
Right.
how we relate to others, and what we ultimately hope for.
All this talk about contradictions and conflicts, it makes you wonder about the real-world consequences of embracing pantheism, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the deep dive, it explores this too.
Really?
Yeah, it highlights some pretty sobering potential outcomes.
Okay, hit me with those sobering outcomes. Why should I care about all these philosophical debates? How could this impact my life?
Well, for one thing, you risk wasting valuable time.
Time.
Yeah, and energy on practices that ultimately don't address the root of human suffering.
Oh, okay.
If we're chasing this illusion of self-divinity or trying to merge with this universe that isn't actually God, we're missing out.
Missing out on what?
On the true transformation that comes from a relationship with the Creator.
It seems like a path that could lead a lot of frustration and disappointment in the long run.
Exactly. Another consequence is spiritual confusion.
Spiritual confusion.
Yeah, all those inherent contradictions and these vague concepts within pantheism, it can leave people feeling disoriented.
Disoriented, yeah.
And lost, lacking a clear understanding of truth or purpose. It's like wandering through this spiritual maze with no exit in sight.
And then there's the moral freefall that can happen when objective truth is thrown out the window.
Oh yeah, that's a huge concern. If everything is God and there's no ultimate standard of right and wrong, then morality becomes subjective, and this could potentially lead to justifications for all sorts of harmful behavior.
Right. Because if there's no right wrong, then anything goes.
Exactly. And the deep dive, it argues that this kind of moral relativism is ultimately destructive.
Destructive.
Yeah, both to individuals and to society as a whole.
So are you saying that pantheism could actually make the world a worse place?
It's definitely a risk. When we lose sight of objective truth and moral accountability, it creates a breeding ground.
A breeding ground for what?
All kinds of chaos and injustice.
That's a pretty sobering thought. So where do we go from here? Is this entire deep dive just a critique of pantheism, or does it offer any alternatives?
It definitely presents a strong critique of pantheism, but it does so to contrast it with the Christian worldview.
So it's presenting a different perspective.
Exactly. Christianity offers a fundamentally different understanding of reality and our place within it.
All right, let's talk about those differences. What does Christianity bring to the table that pantheism seems to be missing?
One key difference is the nature of God.
Okay.
Pantheism sees God as this impersonal force or energy, essentially one with the universe, right?
Right.
Christianity affirms a personal, transcendent creator, one who is distinct from his creation. Think of it like this.
How?
Pantheism sees the painting as the artist, while Christianity recognizes the artist as the one who created the painting.
Interesting analogy. So Christianity offers a God who is involved with his creation, but not consumed by it.
Exactly, and that's a big part of what draws some people away from pantheism and towards Christianity. They experience this longing,
Longing for what?
something deeper than simply merging with the universe, this longing for connection with a God who knows them, loves them, and has a plan for their lives.
But isn't Christianity full of rules and restrictions? How does that appeal to people raised on this freedom and individuality of pantheistic ideas?
That's a common misconception. While Christianity does have moral guidelines, they're not meant to be oppressive. The deep dive, it points out that the Christian view of freedom isn't about doing whatever you want.
Okay.
It's about being liberated from this destructive power of sin and then living a life that's aligned with God's purpose. That's where true fulfillment is found.
So it's less about rules and more about a relationship.
Exactly. It's about discovering who we were created to be and then living in a way that brings us into harmony with God, ourselves, and others.
This whole discussion has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground, from the initial allure of pantheism to its potential pitfalls, and of course this contrasting perspective offered by Christianity. But there's one more thing I'm curious about: neo-pantheism.
Neo-pantheism.
Yeah, that more modern, individualized take on these ideas. Does it avoid the problems we've been talking about?
Unfortunately, not really. The deep dive, it suggests it actually makes things even trickier.
Trickier how?
Well, it tends to be even more eclectic, blending ideas from all these different traditions, but not necessarily addressing the underlying problems. And it can feel more palatable,
Right.
appealing because it's so individualized and flexible.
Yeah.
But that also makes it easier to cherry pick, just take the ideas that feel good without really grappling with the tough questions. It's like making a spiritual smoothie.
A spiritual smoothie.
Yeah, you can blend all sorts of tasty ingredients together, but in the end, it might not be a very nutritious meal.
Makes sense. So is this whole deep dive just about comparing and contrasting pantheism and Christianity? Or does it go deeper into specific aspects of pantheistic thought?
Oh, it definitely digs deeper into the specifics. For example, it tackles this common pantheistic idea.
What idea?
that interconnectedness equals divinity, showing why that logic doesn't hold up.
Okay, break that down for us. Interconnectedness, divinity, what's the connection? Or lack thereof?
This is where pantheism often makes this logical leap that doesn't quite work.
Okay.
It argues that because all things in the universe are interconnected, like ecosystems, energy flows, the web of life,
Mm-hmm.
everything must therefore be divine. It's like saying because all the organs in your body are connected,
Yeah,
they must all be your brain.
that's a hilarious analogy, but I see your point. Interconnectedness doesn't automatically equal divinity.
Right. And the deep dive uses this example of a forest ecosystem. Trees, animals, fungi, microorganisms, they're all interdependent,
Right.
affecting one another in this complex web of relationships. But this interdependence, well, fascinating and essential for life, it doesn't inherently make any of those things divine. They're all part of a created order, not the creator itself.
It seems like this fallacy plays into that very human desire for unity and belonging we talked about earlier. We see interconnectedness, and we want to make it mean something bigger, something spiritual, so we slap the label of divine on it.
You hit the nail on the head. It's that longing to be part of something greater than ourselves, to find meaning and purpose in the universe. But the deep dive reminds us that true unity and meaning aren't found by simply blurring the lines between ourselves and the cosmos.
Right.
It comes from recognizing our place within a created order, and then embracing our relationship with the creator who designed it all.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another core issue highlighted in this deep dive, the pantheistic view of truth.
Oh, yeah, this is where things get really slippery.
Okay, tell me more.
Pantheism, especially in its modern forms, it tends to embrace this highly subjective view of truth,
Okay.
prioritizing personal experience, intuition, individual interpretation, above any kind of external standard or authority.
So kind of like the old saying, what's true for you might not be true for me.
Exactly. And while there's some validity to the idea that we experience and perceive things differently, the deep dive argues that taking this to the extreme, well, it leads to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it makes it almost impossible to have any meaningful conversations
Conversations about what?
about right and wrong, morality, even just basic facts about the world. If everyone's truth is equally valid, then there's no basis for resolving disagreements
Right.
or even holding anyone accountable for their actions. It leads to this kind of moral and intellectual anarchy.
It also seems like it undermines the very idea of learning or growing, right? If my truth is already perfect and complete, why would I need to learn anything new or consider different perspectives?
That's a great point. The deep dive emphasizes that true growth, both intellectually and spiritually, it requires humility. Being willing to admit we don't have all the answers, to learn from others, to be open to having our beliefs challenged. But if truth is purely subjective, rooted in our own feelings, well, there's no motivation to seek anything beyond our own limited understanding.
It seems like this subjective view of truth also makes people incredibly vulnerable to manipulation or deception. If there's no external standard to measure things against, anyone can come along and claim to have the truth, and there's no way to discern if they're being genuine or just peddling their own agenda.
That's a huge concern. The deep dive warns that this lack of objective truth is one of the most dangerous aspects of pantheism, especially in its more modern, individualized forms.
Okay.
Without a solid foundation to stand on, we're constantly at risk of being swept away by the latest spiritual trend or guru or, I don't know, self-help philosophy.
So what's the alternative? How does the Christian understanding of truth differ from this subjective approach?
Christianity affirms that truth is objective. It exists independently of our feelings, our opinions, our interpretations. And the source of this objective truth is God himself,
Okay.
who has revealed himself to humanity through his creation, his word, and ultimately through Jesus Christ.
So it's not about creating our own truth. It's about discovering a truth that already exists.
Exactly. And this truth isn't arbitrary or oppressive.
Okay.
It's meant to set us free. The deep dive uses this analogy of a map. A good map doesn't dictate your journey or limit your freedom. It provides this reliable guide to help you reach your destination.
I like that. So in a way, the Christian understanding of truth is less about my truth and more about the truth.
You got it. And this truth, it isn't just a set of abstract concepts. It's a living, active force that can transform our lives from the inside out.
All right, let's talk about another area where pantheism and Christianity clash, the concept of evil.
Oh yeah, this is a huge point of divergence. As we've mentioned before, pantheism often struggles to account for evil. Some forms see it as an illusion, others as a necessary part of this cosmic balance. Christianity recognizes evil as a real and destructive force.
Okay.
It sees it as a consequence of humanity's rebellion against God. and the presence of spiritual forces that oppose his will.
So in a way, pantheism tries to explain away evil, while Christianity confronts it head on.
Exactly, and that's a crucial difference.
Okay, how so?
Well, if evil's just an illusion or a necessary part of the universe, then there's no real motivation to fight against it or to seek justice for those who are suffering. But if evil is this genuine force that opposes God's goodness, then we have a responsibility
A responsibility to do what?
to resist it, to seek healing for the brokenness it causes, and to point others towards the one who ultimately triumphs over it.
This brings us to another key difference: the role of grace in the Christian worldview.
Oh, this is one of the most beautiful and transformative aspects of Christianity.
Okay,
It really sets it apart from pantheism.
how so?
While pantheism often emphasizes self-effort, self-realization as the path to liberation, Christianity affirms that we can never overcome sin.
You mean we can't overcome the power of sin on our own?
Exactly, or achieve true wholeness on our own. It's only through God's grace, offered through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, that we can experience lasting forgiveness.
So we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We need a helping hand from something or someone greater than ourselves.
Exactly, and that's what makes the Christian message so powerful, especially for those who are weary
Weary of what?
of striving, of seeking, of trying to earn their way to spiritual enlightenment. God's grace, it's a free gift, offered to anyone who chooses to receive it.
Okay, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. We've unpacked the allure of pantheism, exposed its flaws, and explored this contrasting perspective offered by Christianity. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more aspect, something that comes up in the source material: the dangers of idolatry.
Oh yeah, this is a really important point.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when we're considering the allure of pantheism.
Okay?
It's easy to see the beauty and wonder of nature, the interconnectedness of life, and just feel this sense of awe and reverence.
Right?
But the deep dive warns against mistaking that reference for worship.
So in a way, pantheism can become this subtle form of idolatry.
You got it. If we're so focused on the creation, whether it's nature, the universe, even our own perceived divinity,
Right.
that we lose sight of the creator, we're essentially worshiping a false god.
That makes sense. It's like admiring a beautiful painting so much that we forget about the artist who created it.
Exactly. And the deep dive, it argues that this is one of the most subtle but dangerous consequences of pantheism.
Okay.
It distracts us from the true source of life, love, and purpose, and then it leads us down this path that ultimately ends in emptiness.
So how do we guard against that? How do we experience awe and wonder without crossing the line into idolatry?
The key is recognizing that creation, while beautiful and worthy of respect, is ultimately a reflection of the creator,
Right.
not the creator itself.
Okay.
When we see the intricate design of a flower, or the vastness of the starry sky, even the incredible complexity of our own bodies,
Mm-hmm.
our response, it should be one of gratitude towards the one who designed and created it all.
So it's about shifting our focus from the what to the who.
Precisely. And that's where the Christian understanding of worship comes in. It's not about simply admiring the beauty of creation. It's about directing our awe and reverence towards the God who created it. It's about acknowledging his sovereignty, his power, his love, and then responding with gratitude, humility, and this desire to align our lives with his purpose for us.
This has been a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. We've explored the ins and outs of pantheism, uncovered its contradictions and potential consequences, and contrasted it with this fundamentally different perspective offered by Christianity. But one thing's clear: this isn't just an intellectual exercise.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's about grappling with the core questions of human existence, seeking truth, and discovering the path that leads to genuine meaning, purpose, and fulfillment.
And those, my friend, are questions worth pondering long after this deep dive is over. But this source material, it doesn't stop there. It digs even deeper into some of the specifics of pantheistic thought and practices.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What other rabbit holes are we going down today? So we've covered a lot of ground already. Faulty foundations, logical fallacies, clashes with science and Christianity, and even the dangers of idolatry. But this source material goes even deeper, right? Where do we go from here?
You're right, we've barely scratched the surface. This deep dive wants to equip you to understand the specific errors of pantheistic thought. Like, for example, it tackles this idea that our perception of the world is an illusion.
Okay, that sounds trippy. Is it like saying we're all living in the Matrix?
It's similar, but with a spiritual twist. Pantheism often uses the term Maya to describe this illusory nature of reality. Think of it like a movie projected onto a screen. The images we see, the characters, the scenery, the action, They seem real, right?
Yeah, a good movie can really suck you in.
Exactly, but those images aren't really real, they're just projections of light. Pantheism suggests that our everyday experience of the world is kind of like that, like a temporary, illusory prediction of the ultimate reality, which is God.
So is it saying that nothing really matters because it's all just an illusion? That feels kind of bleak.
That's one of the problems the deep dive points out. If everything is just Maya, then why bother with anything? Why try to make the world a better place? Why care about suffering? Why even strive for enlightenment if it's all ultimately meaningless? It creates this paradox where the very idea that we need to wake up from the illusion kind of undermines the idea that the illusion is real in the first place.
That's a good point. It seems like pantheism is constantly tripping over its own feet.
Exactly. It sets up these grand, sweeping claims, but then those claims create all sorts of logical and practical problems.
Speaking of practical problems, this deep dive also touches on some real-world concerns with pantheism, particularly when it comes to morality and ethics.
Right. One of the biggest concerns is that if everything is God, then there's no real basis for objective morality. Who gets to decide what's right and wrong if we're all just expressions of the same divine essence?
It seems like that would lead to a lot of moral relativism where everyone gets to make up their own rules.
Exactly. And the deep dive points out that this kind of moral free-for-all can have dangerous consequences. Without a clear standard of right and wrong, it becomes much easier to justify all sorts of harmful behavior.
It's like everyone gets to be their own god, deciding what's good and bad based on their own whims. That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It definitely can be. And this lack of moral grounding is one of the biggest reasons why many people, especially those coming from a Christian perspective, find pantheism to be ultimately unsatisfying and even dangerous.
So what's the alternative? How does Christianity approach the whole issue of morality and ethics?
Christianity affirms that there is a standard of right and wrong, one that comes from a God who is outside of ourselves and who has revealed his moral will to humanity. This provides a solid foundation for making ethical decisions and holding ourselves and others accountable for our actions.
So it's not just about what feels right to me in the moment. It's about aligning myself with a higher moral standard.
Exactly. And that standard isn't arbitrary or oppressive. It's rooted in God's character, which is love, justice, mercy, and holiness.
It sounds like that would provide a much more stable and secure basis for building a just and compassionate society.
That's the idea. When we ground our morality in something beyond our own limited understanding and selfish desires, we're more likely to make decisions that benefit not just ourselves, but also those around us.
That makes sense. So we've talked about the logical problems with pantheism, its ethical dilemmas, and even its potential dangers. But I'm still curious about why this idea keeps popping up throughout history and even today. Why are people so drawn to pantheism?
It's a great question, and the deep dive offers some insights into the psychology behind pantheism's appeal. For one thing, it taps into this very human longing for unity and belonging.
Okay, I can relate to that. Who doesn't want to feel connected to something bigger than themselves?
Right. And pantheism offers this seemingly simple and beautiful solution. We're all part of God, we're all interconnected, we're all one. It can feel very comforting and reassuring, especially in a world that can often feel chaotic and fragmented.
It almost feels like a spiritual bypass, using spirituality to avoid the messy realities of life.
Exactly, and that's where the danger lies. If we're using pantheism or any spiritual belief system to avoid dealing with our own brokenness, the pain of the world, or the consequences of our actions, we're not actually growing or finding true fulfillment. We're just creating this pretty illusion that eventually crumbles.
So it's like choosing to live in a fantasy world instead of facing reality.
You could say that, and while it might feel good in the short term, it ultimately prevents us from experiencing the kind of deep, transformative growth that comes from confronting our challenges head-on and seeking real solutions.
That makes sense. So if pantheism isn't the answer, what is? What does this deep dive offer as a more satisfying and ultimately truer way of understanding reality?
This is where the source material really gets to the heart of its message. It presents the Christian worldview as this compelling alternative to pantheism, one that addresses those same deep human longings for unity, meaning, and purpose, but does so in a way that's both logically sound and ethically grounded.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. How does the Christian understanding of God differ from the pantheistic view?
In pantheism, God is often seen as this impersonal force or energy, essentially inseparable from the universe. It's like saying the ocean is the water and the waves and the currents all blended together. But Christianity affirms a personal God who is distinct from his creation, the artist who created the painting, not the painting itself.
So a God who is both involved with his creation and separate from it.
Exactly. The source material emphasizes that God is both transcendent, meaning he exists beyond the universe, and immanent, meaning he's present and active within his creation. It's a bit of a paradox, but it allows for a much more dynamic and personal understanding of God.
That definitely aligns with the Christian idea of a God who loves us, cares for us, and interacts with us on a personal level. But how does that address this human longing for unity and connection that draws so many people to pantheism?
That's a great question, and the answer lies in the Christian understanding of relationship. While pantheism seeks unity through this kind of merging or blending with the divine, Christianity offers unity through a personal relationship with God. It's not about becoming God, but about knowing God, loving God, and being loved by God.
That sounds like a much more personal and intimate kind of connection.
It is, and it's a connection that's built on trust, communication, and this shared purpose. It's not about losing ourselves in some vague cosmic oneness, but about discovering our unique identity as beloved children of God and living in a way that reflects his character and fulfills his purposes for our lives.
Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense. But what about the whole issue of suffering and evil? Pantheism seems to have a hard time explaining that, and Christianity doesn't exactly shy away from the reality of darkness and brokenness in the world. How does Christianity reconcile the idea of a loving God with the presence of so much pain and suffering?
That's one of the biggest questions that people grapple with, both inside and outside of Christianity, and the deep dive acknowledges that there are no easy answers. But it does offer a perspective that moves beyond simply trying to explain away suffering or pretend it doesn't exist.
So what is that perspective? How does Christianity make sense of suffering in a way that pantheism doesn't?
It starts by acknowledging that suffering is real, and it's a result of sin, humanity's rebellion against God, and the brokenness that this rebellion has brought into the world.
So it's not that God causes suffering, it's that he allows it. But why would a loving God allow so much pain?
That's the tough part, right? But the deep dive points out that God allows suffering for a purpose. He uses it to draw us closer to himself, to refine our character, and to ultimately bring about his greater purposes in the world. It's kind of like a sculptor chiseling away at a block of stone to reveal the beautiful statue within. The process can be painful, but the end result is something truly magnificent.
That's a powerful analogy. But it's still hard to grasp, especially when we're in the midst of our own pain or watching someone we love suffer.
Absolutely. And Christianity doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes, but it does offer hope.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more about this hope. What does it look like within the Christian worldview?
It's the hope that comes from knowing that God is not indifferent to our suffering. He entered into our pain in the person of Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect life, died on the cross for our sins, and rose again, conquering death and offering us the promise of eternal life.
So it's not just about enduring suffering in this life, but about the hope of a future where suffering is ultimately defeated.
Exactly, and even in the midst of our current struggles, we have the comfort of knowing that God is with us. He understands our pain, and he's working to bring good out of even the most difficult situations.
That's a really powerful message, especially for those who are struggling to find hope in the face of pain and loss. But doesn't pantheism also offer a kind of escape from suffering, through this idea of merging with the divine and transcending the limitations of our individual selves?
It does on the surface, but the deep dive points out that this escape is ultimately an illusion. It's a way of bypassing the problem instead of truly addressing it. It's like taking a painkiller to numb the pain instead of going to the doctor to treat the underlying cause.
So it's a temporary fix, but not a real solution.
Exactly. And in the long run, it can actually make things worse. If we never face our pain, we can't grow from it, heal from it, or help others who are going through similar struggles.
This whole conversation has really challenged me to think differently about pantheism and Christianity. It seems like pantheism offers a lot of appealing ideas, but when you really dig into them, they often fall apart under scrutiny. Christianity, on the other hand, presents a more robust and ultimately more satisfying worldview, one that acknowledges the complexities of life while offering real hope and a path towards true transformation.
I agree. And the deep dive doesn't just present these two worldviews as abstract concepts, it also explores how they play out in the lives of real people.
Okay, that's a perfect transition. In our next segment, we'll dive into the personal stories of some Gen Z individuals who have made the journey from pantheism to finding faith in Christ. Their experiences offer a powerful glimpse into the transformative power of encountering the Christian worldview and embracing the hope and freedom it offers.
I'm looking forward to hearing their stories. It's always inspiring to see how God is working in the lives of people from all walks of life, drawing them to himself and revealing his truth in ways that are both personal and profound.
All right, so we've gone deep into the philosophy behind pantheism, explored its contradictions, and compared it with the Christian worldview. Now let's shift gears a bit.
Time to hear from some real people.
Exactly. We're going to hear from some Gen Z individuals who were raised on pantheism but ended up finding faith in Christ.
I always find these stories so fascinating.
Me too. It's like taking those big ideas we've been talking about and seeing how they play out in real life.
Exactly. It's one thing to debate philosophy in a vacuum, but it's another thing entirely to see how those ideas actually impact people's lives, their choices, their experiences.
Absolutely. So what are some of the common threads that emerge in these Gen Z conversion stories? What made them question pantheism and ultimately embrace Christianity?
Well, one of the biggest things they talk about is this disillusionment. This disillusionment with living in a world where truth is purely subjective.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they felt lost in this sea of opinions and interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And they craved something solid, something reliable to anchor their beliefs. And many of them, they found that anchor in the objective truth claims of Christianity.
That makes sense. If everything is relative and truth is just a matter of personal opinion, it can be really hard to build a solid foundation for your life, right? It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Exactly. And these young people, they were yearning for something more stable.
So something that could withstand the storms of life.
Yes, exactly.
So it sounds like they were experiencing this tension between the subjective, feel-good vibes of pantheism and a growing desire for something more grounded, more objective.
You got it. And for many of them, this desire for objective truth, it went hand in hand with a growing awareness of their own limitations
Okay.
and the reality of evil in the world. Pantheism's promise of self-divinity,
Yeah.
it just couldn't account for the brokenness they saw around them or the struggles they experienced in their own lives.
It's like they were bumping up against the limits of what pantheism could offer, both intellectually and experientially.
Exactly. It just wasn't enough.
So what was it about Christianity specifically that drew them in?
Many of them talk about this transformative power of encountering a personal God, a God who knows them, loves them, and has a plan for their lives.
Yeah.
This was a radical departure from that impersonal, cosmic force that pantheism often portrays.
It's like going from this vague sense of being part of something bigger to a deep, personal connection with someone who truly knows and cares for you.
Right. And this personal relationship with God, it provided a sense of purpose and meaning and belonging that they hadn't found in pantheism.
That's so powerful. So it sounds like their journey wasn't just about changing beliefs. It was about experiencing a profound shift in their identity and really their understanding of reality.
Absolutely. A complete paradigm shift, really. They went from seeing themselves as like sparks of the divine to recognizing themselves as beloved children of a loving creator.
Wow. And I imagine that shift had a ripple effect on every area of their lives.
You better believe it. It affected everything.
So what were some of the practical outcomes of this transformation? How did their lives actually change after embracing Christianity?
Many of them talk about experiencing a newfound freedom. Freedom from the things that had been holding them back.
Holding them back, like what?
Oh, you name it. Addiction, destructive behaviors, or even just this general sense of emptiness and lack of purpose. They found this new identity, an identity rooted in God's love,
Mm-hmm.
and a joy that came from living in alignment with His plan for their lives.
That's an incredible testament to the power of the gospel, right? It's not just about intellectual assent. It's about experiencing a real, tangible transformation in our hearts and in our lives.
Absolutely. It changes everything.
These stories offer this powerful challenge to the claims of pantheism, don't they? I mean, if pantheism is truly the path to enlightenment and liberation, why are so many people finding something more profound, more fulfilling, and more genuinely transformative in Christianity?
Right. It begs the question, isn't it?
It really does, and it brings us back to the core message of this entire deep dive. While pantheism might offer some alluring ideas, it ultimately falls short. It just can't address the deepest longings of the human heart.
I think that's right.
Christianity, on the other hand, offers this path, a path that leads to lasting truth, genuine freedom, and ultimately a love that transcends our limitations and gives us hope for a future that's even bigger and more beautiful than we can imagine.
That's beautifully said. And for those listening, for anyone who's exploring these ideas, I think the most important takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
Right.
Challenge your assumptions and be open to where the truth might lead.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get swept away by those latest spiritual trends or the allure of those easy answers.
Oh, I know.
But true fulfillment, it comes from seeking truth with humility, with courage, and with an open heart.
And that, my friend, is a journey worth taking, no matter where you're starting from.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've explored the intricate world of pantheism, exposed its errors, and discovered a compelling alternative through the Christian worldview. But the conversation doesn't end here. We hope this exploration has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to continue seeking and questioning and diving deeper into the mysteries of life and faith. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep seeking truth, keep challenging assumptions, and keep diving deep. C20.72